Anyway, let's get started. Does anyone have a question? Bob. Wait a second. Let's.
Anything to stand up for a second. A quick clarifying question for Karen Hunter. The term universal access that you use, are you including articles that may be readily discoverable through something like Google Scholar, but for which the inquirer might have to pay an article charge to view?
Yes, I am, but you have to remember there are other ways of getting those articles other than a charge. So you can get them through interlibrary loan. You can get them from on-site accesses at any of our subscribers. So there are other ways to get them.
Okay. Other questions? Other questions?
Don't call it off yet.
Okay.
Okay, could I start by answering a question?
Certainly.
Who was the one that asked, is the Biomed Central, what is a journal? Well, a journal is a peer review certifier, peer review service provider and certifier. The rest is just about the medium. It used to be that you had to get it on paper. It used to be it had to be delivered online. Well, in the green open access era where authors are putting up all their final drafts free for all, the only remaining essential service that the publisher has to provide is the peer review and then to certified with their imprimatur and their track record. Sandy pointed out that copy editing was very important, and if it is, then the cost of that important service will be wrapped into the peer review. It'll be peer review plus copy editing. That's an empirical question, how important it is. If it's really important, and in fact, if all of the other services that Karen mentioned are also important, then subscriptions will remain sustainable even when everything is green open access. That's all an empirical question. The only part that's an open and shut case, or right now shut but needs to be open, is that it all needs to be put up there in green open access. That sounded like an answer rather than a question, and it was. But I wanted to ask in your worry about proliferation of versions, how deep is your worry? I mean, is it this deep? Is it so deep that if the data that say that there are many people out there who can't access a journal, really can't access it because their institutions can't afford it, they can't afford interlibrary loan, they need it right away, et cetera, is your worry about proliferation of versions so deep that you would rather that they didn't have a green OA version, you'd rather they had nothing? But if it isn't, then why are you even raising that worry?
My worry is specifically about scholarship and how scholarship is done. I readily admit that, as I mentioned, for classroom use for students, as happens always, professors hand out drafts of papers they're writing. That's perfectly adequate for that purpose. I think, it doesn't even have to be peer-reviewed for that purpose. I think for the immediate purposes like that. I would say also for the members of the public, who are concerned mainly to get sort of basic factual information from medical articles, it's important that they be peer-reviewed. That's very important for that purpose. I don't think it's so important that, other things be absolutely perfect. I'm working off the studies that have been done that show that scholars tend to be lazy and they don't go back to original sources. They will pick up errors that are made and repeat those errors ad infinitum, and that to me promotes sloppy scholarship. And I see that as my principal concern, which is, partly why I would hope that there's some kind of gold OA solution here, because that does provide the version of record in its fully fleshed form, fully copied and everything else. My question back to you, Stephen, if I may, is that green OA is now parasitic upon the system of peer review as it's run by publishers. Let's say hypothetically that the big commercial publishers, the 7 or 8 that dominate the business, just decide that all of a sudden they're not going to make enough money to stay in the business, and they decide to take their money elsewhere. Now, there are growing outfits like Hindawi and others that have sprung up to sort of fill the gap, but if those major players were to exit the scene rapidly, you have a huge number of journals that would be left in the lurch, so to speak, and then the peer review would need to be provided by whom?
The first answer that I suggested, which was that a journal is just a peer review service provider and then certifier of the outcome with its title. Titles migrate, of course. I mean, if a publisher decides that he's not going to support his title anymore, the title migrates. And I'm sure Hindawi and Biomed Central are quite happy to take on more titles. There are many titles that can simply take the software for peer review for themselves, take the gold OA. Remember, we're talking about not paying anything for anything, but simply paying for the remaining services. There are journals I don't even know whether in the open access era we need fleet journal publishing anymore. Maybe it's enough just to have cottage journals taking their peer review fees and providing their peer review. The stable of referees stays the same. The authorship stays the same. The only thing is it migrates from one imprimatur to another with the same title.
Okay, back to the audience. Question. Bob.
Thank you. A lot has been said today about peer review, and indeed I think we might agree that peer review is fundamental to our system of scholarly communication. But I would like to suggest that we need to pay attention to the limitations of peer review as an effective instrument for quality assurance. Peer review is subject to all of the vicissitudes of any other human activity, subjectivity, enthusiasms, bias, avarice, and at its best it is unreliable in some respects, and at its worst it has been, in fact, as we have had famous recent examples, hijacked for the purpose of controlling the literature in a given discipline. I don't have an alternative instrument to suggest, but I do think it behooves us to be aware of and be mindful of the limitations of peer review as the sole fundamental mechanism for assurance of quality in scholarly communication.
Thank you. I'd actually like Heather to maybe comment on that, because those that in the audience that know me, I usually have lots of opinions on things. I'm trying to hold myself back. But maybe if you could talk about the innovative mechanisms as you demonstrated, the commenting and things like that, that could possibly buttress peer review or seeing other alternatives to respond to Bob's comment.
I agree, first of all, with Bob fully. It's very difficult to talk about peer review in a presentation about open access because there's been so much conflation over that notion. I was really happy to have Karen come out and say, no, we fully think that open access journals has nothing to do with the quality of peer review. It's the model that supports this. But there's been so much of this holding up of the potential threat to the sacred cow of peer review that open access represents that I think we've forgotten about the new opportunities that opening up accessibility to anyone can bring to help improve the system of peer review, to build on it. The idea of comments, I mean, that may work for some journals, may not work for others, but I do think that this idea of scholarly communication and of what is now scholarly journals and scholarly publishing, we have the ability to morph it into something that more closely mimics the real communication process that I think benefits science and scholarship in a way that says peer review is one way to do this, but this ongoing conversation in a digital environment can be enabled to I think, really add another layer of quality on top of peer review.
Sandy? And then,
I just want to raise a question for Heather, though, and it picks up on that to a certain extent. Stephen was good enough to post a link on Live License recently to an article written by Joseph Beal, which was a study of 9 predatory open access journals. And there are a bunch of them. Just within the past week, I received emails from 2 of these, reputed journals inviting me to submit articles to them. And it's clear that they are trading on, the whole open access movement to amount what are essentially scam operations. They purport to have editorial boards, which don't really exist. They purport to go through the peer review process. When you look at them closely, they don't really do that. And even alarmingly, Richard Pointer interviewed one of the owners of one of these outfits recently, which had been admitted to membership in the Association of Open Access Publishers, so that even that organization had not been carefully enough checking the credentials of these to keep them out. So how do you deal with that problem? It seems to be particularly a problem in the open access arena because it's so easy to set yourself up and to pretend to be a publisher without really being a publisher.
Yeah, I don't know whether folks are familiar with the incident that Sandy's referring to. There was a publisher that had been admitted into the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association that was not meeting the criteria for peer review that association had set out. I'm not generally a glass half full kind of a gal. I'm generally the glass is half empty and what's left is probably suspect, so don't drink it. But I actually think this is a good problem for the open access publishers in the open access movement to have, because it does. We are in the same arena that subscription and traditional access publishers are in, which is caveat emptor, buyer beware, right? Not just because you say you're an open access publisher or may be an open access publisher doesn't mean that you're necessarily perfect and above reproach. And I think authors need to apply the same kind of scrutiny to the editorial boards and the peer review process and the kinds of business practices that open access publishers apply. Those same stringent standards should be applied that we currently apply when we're choosing a subscription access journal. I want to ask the audience one question about peer review, because I think this is an area where people talk a lot about a process that, how many people have been a peer reviewer? How many people have run a peer review journal? So a handful of people run a peer review journal. I think we talk a lot about, I ran peer review journals for 15 years and actually helped develop online peer review software for biomedical journals. I've never seen, if you put 4 scientists in a room, I've never seen 4 scientists agree about how things should be peer reviewed and how it should be run. And yet somehow this is something that we're not allowed to voice any kind of concerns or suggest that this is a system that might need improvement in any way. I know it was slightly off the question that you posed, but hopefully I answered your question and raised another one as well.
Deborah?
I think one major point is that, as both Karen and I said, I think publishers are there to support the scientific endeavors. Scientists have decided that the best way, or the academy has decided the best way to rate quality and rate the careers of scientists and researchers is by peer review. So it's not something that the publishers or the journals are imposing, it's something that is the way that academia works at the moment. It's not something we're going to change. We have to change with you guys. So I think it's the job of academia to decide what they want to do in terms of rating people's work and choosing how best to do that. And we will continue to help you do whatever you decide. But I think it's really a question back to academia rather than to the publishers about how that happens.
Karen, did you want to follow up?
Just one anecdote that makes me shiver a bit. I was recently asked if I would peer review an article by a guest editor of a journal. I won't say who the publisher was, because I just think it's better I don't say that. But I was invited, and it was an article about which I was absolutely ill-equipped to comment, and it took me 3 tries to convince this guest editor that I was not an appropriate peer reviewer, and that kind of thing scares me a bit.
Clifford?
I'd just like to make a couple comments on this. The first is that I think that there is some evidence emerging, although a lot of it is still anecdotal and hallway kinds of things among journal editors, that the peer review system as we currently practice it, which makes absolutely profligate use of human time, is starting to have some real problems scaling. When you look at the time pressures that academics are under, and you see these people who are being asked to review 8 or 10 papers a month, they're either starting to just go into shutdown mode and say, I won't take any of them, or to do very, very superficial kind of jobs. It may be that we need to start thinking about ways to focus peer review time more effectively. It's very interesting to see what some of the physicists have done with arXiv. It's not that papers coming out of there don't get peer reviewed, it's that it kind of acts as a front-end filter, and there are things that don't get peer reviewed because the conversation prior to going into that system has made it unnecessary. So I do think we need to be thinking a bit about that. We're also, I think, seeing some interesting asymmetric problems. For example, there is tremendous submission to U.S. journals from abroad, which is generating a lot of peer review activity, yet it's not clear they're really drawing on the same group that's submitting to do reviews. So we've got some international asymmetries surfacing as well. The last thing I want to say is that we actually speak of two kinds of peer review. And it's very important to separate them because we've started conflating them in what I think is an extraordinarily damaging way. One kind of peer review is about an article and whether the article is correct and should be published. The other is the kind of peer review that a faculty member undergoes by his or her peers, both within the host institution and beyond, for tenure and promotion. And what we are seeing all too often, I think, now is this sort of outsourcing where you take transactional things about articles, throw in a dash of impact factor, stir carefully, and use this as a very, very bad proxy for really kind of measured and deep examination of the kind of aggregate scholarly contribution of someone being considered for tenure or promotion.
I want to make a plug here for UNT, for those of you both from UNT and also OA, but we have one of the principal investigators for a current National Science Foundation project, Britt Holbrook from the Department of Philosophy, and his colleague Robert Frodeman, who's PI on it, and we're working with them as well on a comparative assessment of the peer review processes at 6 national funding agencies, 3 in the United States and 1 in Canada and 2 in Europe. And again, looking at this from a variety of perspectives, in this case, looking at how are they incorporating the broader impacts criteria that NSF has pushed, and as well as other things. So there's yet a third kind of peer review process for the funding opportunities out there as well. So another question from the audience, and we're going to have to wind it up here after this one. Who has the most burning question? One more?